Dan Pearson, Cato Institute, and apologies about lack of diversity here because my question is specifically for Brian. And you have stated that USTR very much worked for 12 years, data exclusivity, and you're close to this, so you would know. Following it from the sidelines, I'm seeing a situation where one White House office, USTR, in theory is advocating 12 years. Another White House office, OMB, very much pushing 7 years, including it, I think, in each of the last 4 budgets, including the one that was just released last month. So I'm watching from the distance and thinking, okay, OMB negotiated this just about as they want. They got about roughly 7 years out of TPP, and they're setting things up so that in the future they can pursue rollback in the US statute to get it back to 7 years. What am I missing here? Was USTR really trying?
And the next question.
Lauren Nguyen with the U.S. Export-Import Bank, but as a matter of full disclosure, I handle content protection for the MPA before that. Diversity here, this question is for Jeremy, and I guess for Mike as well. Jeremy, on the fair use issue, if I understand you correctly, you said that with the 3-part fair use test that was enacted in the revision to the Berne Convention, that you don't have a problem with that, but that I think you said you're still not quite happy with it. So I guess my question is, what are you advocating as a fair use test? And same question for Mike as well.
All right, Brian, you have the microphone. Why don't you start and then hand it over to Jeremy?
Sure. So it's a good question, Dan. Actually, I think it's been 6 budgets, actually, where the president has sought to change the period of data protection for biologics in the United States to 7 years. It was certainly the case early in the negotiations where it took a bit of convincing on the part of the industry to get USTR to table the offer of 12 years. But in my experience, once USTR did table it, they did go to the mat. And I really, again, this is from my sort of conversations and public, what's also available to the public, but I really think they did everything they could possibly hope to do. OMB is a separate agency, it's a separate issue, it's a domestic issue specifically, it's a policy prerogative of the president, and I would just note, for those of us who are involved in the congressional process, the president's budget is usually, it's really just a statement of policy, it's never really going to pass, to be clear. And this most recent budget, more than most, because you may know that the numbers had already been scheduled. So really, it's just a reiteration of the president's long-standing policy. But from USTR perspective, they were pushing hard because they were complying with their requirements under TPA that passed last year that required them to do so. They were doing it. They did, as far as I can tell, everything in their power to try to get to that result. But it wasn't in the cards.
Thanks. It is a little confusing that there's a 4-factor fair use test and then there's a 3-step test in Berne, and so people often get confused about the overlap between these two things. We believe that the fair use exception in US law is fully compatible with the 3-step test in the Berne Convention. But some others disagree, and that was the submission that was made by the motion picture industry in Australia, that maybe fair use would not be compatible with the 3-step test. We think that's a really dangerous argument to go down, which puts US jurisprudence at risk if we even accept that as a possibility. So we don't think that's the case. We think it is acceptable, but we want to make sure that the 3-step test, if it's replicated in other instruments like the TPP, is replicated very, very carefully so that we don't end up artificially narrowing it even further and placing fair use at risk. So the original draft of the TPP could have done that by having a narrower version of the 3-step test than what we find in Berne and TRIPS. Luckily, in the end, as I was trying to say, it didn't do that because it explicitly says, it imports the 3-step test and then says, but this is not intended to expand or contract the interpretation of the 3-step test under Berne or TRIPS. So in the end, probably it does no harm.
So when Jeremy made that point before, I was kind of surprised because the language on the three-step test in US FTAs has been more or less constant since 2002. Every FTA has had kind of identical language. So the idea that something changed between the draft and the final was dubious to me. I actually went back and looked at the EFF's webpage, and it's not gauged at a previous copy. It's gauged under a heading that says the final IP chapter includes many detailed requirements that are more restrictive than current international standards. And then under that, enact a three-step test. I'm just reading you what their own language is and compare it to what Jeremy said, make your own conclusions. Enact a three-step test language that puts restrictions on fair use. The U.S. Trade Representative is putting fair use at risk with restrictive language in the TPP's IP chapter. Again, that's under a section that talks about the final IP chapter. So, I mean, I just think that there's some inconsistency here. There's other inconsistency as well that I think is worth pointing out with respect to intermediary liability. 2013 ISO Hunt brief by EFF talked about praised the DMCA safe harbors as an extraordinary success in promoting the growth of the internet as an unprecedented opportunity to create, disseminate, and access free expression. That same webpage criticizes the DMCA's safe harbors. TPP will further entrench controversial aspects of U.S. copyright law, such as the DMCA, place greater liability on internet intermediaries. The TPP would force the adoption of the U.S. DMCA internet intermediary safe harbor regime in its entirety on other countries. So you have on the one hand 2013 brief to the court, which by the way they're subject to obligations with respect to court filings about their views, praising the DMCA and its safe harbors as an extraordinary success in promoting the digital economy, and now using it as a demonization of the TPP. I just think we need to take some of the criticisms in context of other things that some folks have said.